sobre climate catastrophe y autor del libro Incorporar Climate Change a sus políticas catastrophe, a ser publicado por Oxford University. Así que bueno, estamos a esta presentación que excepcionalmente va a ser en inglés. Sí, bueno, empiezo con todo.
Ok, gracias. Oye, en primer lugar, muchas gracias al Instituto de Graficar y especialmente a Conferencia por organizar este día. Voy a presentar un paper en inglés por dos razones realmente. En primer lugar, hay términos muy técnicos que son difíciles de traducir, pero aún más para salvarlos de mi acento horrible. No haber dicho eso, después que sabías, pudiste tratar de explicar cualquier concepto al día en castellano después de la presentación. Solo pregúntame si tienen dudas. También estoy feliz de recibir cualquier pregunta en español y voy a tratar de responder en español también hasta el punto que pueda. With that, I will switch to English. So I put a lot, puse mucho en el PowerPoint. Ojalá con eso también va a ser okay, so my paper starts with a very basic political dilemma that when cooperating, sometimes the most efficacious allocation of burdens is not always the fairest. This is a dilemma in the sense that for many of us living today, a commitment to fairness holds so much weight, it's so important, that we often think that it's better to abandon a common project rather than to accept an inequitable distribution of the benefits and burdens related to it. We don't want to do it if it's not fair. On the other hand, there are certainly some cases in which the ends of our shared endeavors are not elective, not chosen, or are so valuable that we may think that cooperation should proceed regardless of fairness concerns, even if it is unfair. I think this is true in warfare, maybe, also in healthcare sometimes. Preserving the state or preserving public health are so important that we may sometimes be willing to accept some amount of unfairness if doing that is necessary or more effective for realizing those ends. Now, in those cases, we might certainly hope that our shared goals can be met without unduly or arbitrarily burdening any particular person. Nevertheless, trade-offs often are unavoidable, such that we must sacrifice either some amount of fairness if our goals are going to be met, or some amount of efficacy if uncoerced cooperation is to continue. So with that, we have a central political problem, which is determining which of those two values should take priority in any given situation. Now, in the paper I'm discussing today, I argue that the imperative of preventing catastrophic climate change represents another example of this basic political dilemma. In other words, I argue that because of decades of inaction, we may no longer be able to limit some of the most harrowing effects of climate change, including sea level rise, proliferation of diseases, mass extinctions, agricultural collapse, and extreme water scarcity, without imposing unfair burdens on some people, some parties. Now, this is particularly clear in the intergenerational context. There is likely no way to prevent climate catastrophe unless those of us alive right now, today, make substantial sacrifices for the sake of future people. But those future people are widely expected to be far wealthier than we are right now, even with serious climate change. That might be surprising to some of you. That was surprising to me. But most economists believe, even with substantial climate change, future people are going to be far wealthier than we are. So when we make sacrifices, it's poorer people sacrificing for richer people. The same basic point holds internationally or intra-generationally. Among states today, effective precautionary action against climate catastrophe may require imposing significant costs or developmental delays on relatively poorer states like China or India, for which they may never receive full compensation, or on states that are not in any way significantly responsible for the problem. For instance, Chile might have to make sacrifices in dealing with this, but Chile is not the reason that we have climate change, right? Now, those kind of policies may be unfair, but at the same time, they may be necessary if we're going to avert catastrophe. Now, because of the tension between fairness and efficacy in the context of climate change has not really been very well explored in the literature, it remains unclear under what conditions and to what extent prioritizing effective precautionary action over fairness concerns can be justifiable, assuming that it can be justifiable. And that's the problem that I focus on. Now, broadly speaking, I argue that prioritizing efficacy over fairness is justified when societies face a particular kind of catastrophic situation, one that I think climate change threatens to pull us all into. Now, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the idea of climate catastrophe is frequently invoked when attempting to motivate the need for or otherwise justify precautionary action or climate emergency. But what catastrophe means is not always clear. Now, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, catastrophe is a sudden disaster, widespread, very fatal signal. There's a famous legal scholar, Cass Sunstein, political theorist too, who says that catastrophes are instances of harm that involve a large number of human deaths. Another legal scholar who's done work on it wrote a book called Catastrophe. He says that catastrophes are events that threaten the survival of the human race. Now, I think the focus on death in these accounts makes very clear the moral relevance of precautionary action. But we might wonder if death is a sufficient or even a necessary feature of catastrophe. After all, it seems true that instances of extreme suffering can be catastrophic before or apart from human death. What about cases of severe political instability, in which norms and institutions break down? We tend to think those situations are catastrophic too. In the paper, I develop a concept that actually is kind of the whole focus of my book that I call political catastrophe to kind of capture those omitted elements. Now, I define political catastrophe as a state of extreme material scarcity in which meeting one's basic needs can only be done by denying another person or other people the ability to do the same. It's a zero-sum situation. Count as a political catastrophe, the scarcity, the material scarcity I'm talking about, it has to be enduring, but not necessarily permanent and irreversible. It has to be irremediable. Ooh, that word's hard. Irremediable. You can't fix it by simple local efficiency gains or redistributions of resources. And it must affect at least a sizable minority of a given population. Now, when extreme and enduring scarcity of this kind occurs, it becomes impossible to realize or sustain relations of justice, and by extension, uncoerced forms of social cooperation. And this, of course, critically endangers the stability of democratic governance structures, or really any government at all. It's very hard to have a stable political order. It's very hard to have fairness when people don't have enough to eat, right? Now, the idea that justice only applies in or depends upon conditions of material sufficiency, that's an idea that I stole from John Rawls, that he stole from David Hume. Now, Rawls refers to these conditions as the objective circumstances of justice, which he defines as the conditions under which human cooperation is both possible and necessary. Now, Rawls says the most important circumstance of justice is the condition of moderate scarcity. The condition of moderate scarcity says that natural and other resources are not so abundant that schemes of cooperation become superfluous, nor are conditions so harsh that fruitful ventures must inevitably break down. For instance, right now, we have enough sunlight and we don't have to distribute sunlight. Access to sunlight is not really a problem of justice, but access to fresh, clean water is becoming, right? That's the point for John Rawls. Now, the basic idea here then is that without adequate material resources, justice becomes difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. Now, if a situation like that is not corrected, before long, it's going to lead to social and political collapse. Now, that idea is basically the center of my argument. I claim that the imperative of responding to political catastrophe makes deviations from ordinary moral constraints permissible. Now, I am not saying that morality in general disappears in these situations or no longer applies, but rather that if resolving the catastrophe quickly and effectively requires an unfair allocation of burdens, that would be justified. Now, that still might sound scary, but it's helpful to remember that something like this idea is already widely accepted in many contexts. I think medical triage offers a clear example of this. Under normal conditions, clinicians, people who work in hospitals, are expected, and I'm quoting from a medical triage textbook here, they're expected to devote maximum time and resources to the sickest patients without respect to morally arbitrary factors like age or expected recovery time or weight and so on. Now, in cases of extreme scarcity, however, those same arbitrary factors might become determinative of the allocation of medical resources. For instance, in the case of vaccine shortages, officials may justifiably discriminate based on age. For instance, prioritizing the very young and the very old. That's what happened here, right? We were first doing the COVID-19 vaccines. Who got those vaccines first? The oldest people. With reason, is what I'm trying to say. Now, this example suggests that under conditions of extreme scarcity, the principles, rules, and values normally governing the dispensation of medical care are justifiably outweighed by and subordinated to higher order concerns like saving the most lives or protecting the most vulnerable. I argue that the same dynamic holds true when confronting more general instances of extreme scarcity. The principles and values that normally guide the moral political calculus that help us determine how to distribute resources, those might be justifiably subordinated to conditions to considerations of efficacy when we have to restore or preserve the material basis of justice. Now, I have two basic arguments in the paper in support of that claim, which is to say, in support of the claim that we can justifiably prioritize precautionary efficacy over fairness in cases of political catastrophe. The first of those arguments is really complex and I think a little bit boring, so I won't describe it right now. I'd be happy to try to describe it later if there's interest and you'd like pain. The second argument is more fun. I call it the paradox of justice because it's modeled on Karl Popper's famous paradox of intolerance. Now, Karl Popper's paradox says that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. Now, the essential idea for Popper was that if a society tolerates the expression of all beliefs, including intolerant ones, eventually it might be unable to sustain tolerance, particularly if those intolerant views proliferate and become very common. In such a case, Popper explains, the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. John Rawls, interestingly, shares Popper's view. He says that if the tolerant in a given society sincerely and with reason believe that their own security and that of the institutions of liberty are in danger, they may justifiably restrict the freedom of intolerant sects. I think a kind of similar paradoxical relationship holds with respect to justice. That is, if particular applications of justice threaten the continued viability of justice in general in a specific society at a specific time, then we must limit those particular applications of justice for the sake of preserving justice more generally, and by extension, political stability. In fact, what I'm saying is that we can limit justice for the sake of justice, as when we relax fairness standards to ensure that we can respond to political potential. Now, of course, this raises the question of what it actually means to prioritize precautionary efficacy over fairness. What does precaution against politically catastrophic climate change entail, or any kind of political catastrophe? In the paper, I answered this by looking at various theories and principles of precaution, both in political theory, literature, and in international law. This leads me to my own kind of pet theory of precautionary duty, which has a few different parts. The first I call the general precautionary duty, not very inventive. And this just says that all agents have a general duty to prevent scientifically plausible, reasonably likely threats of political catastrophe where possible. That I take to imply two correlate duties. The first of these is the negative duty, not to harm, which just says agents should not harm other agents. Now, on my view, I adopt a kind of technical definition of harm. I say that harm occurs whenever some agents, by their unnecessary actions or inexcusable omissions, cause or allow political catastrophe to affect others. Second, there's this positive duty to protect, which just says that agents should take all reasonable measures to protect others from harm in the form of political catastrophe. Now, as probably many of you know, whenever you have a positive duty, that can be really demanding. It can require quite a lot of resources. It can be hard to satisfy. Create really significant burdens. For that reason, I introduced what I call the reasonableness proviso. And this says that precautionary burdens related to the duty to protect cannot be so great as to themselves cause political catastrophe. And finally, we got the secondary fairness principle, which is to say that agents should ensure that the burdens of precaution are distributed fairly, to the fullest extent compatible with satisfying other duties. So this is a secondary principle. After we've taken care of the other stuff, that we start to care about fairness. Now, in the paper, I call this massive words the integrationist approach. I call it that because it combines realist political thinking with a commitment to justice. Now, in the rest of the paper, after I present this argument, this is kind of the center of it. I start to look at objections. I look at 4 objections in particular. 2 of them, again, I'm just going to set aside because they're pretty technical and not super interesting. But I'll talk about 2 that I do think are a little bit more challenging and important. The first objection says, look, climate change might really cause serious damage, but it's unlikely to cause political catastrophe. You're exaggerating, Ross. That's the objection. And for that reason, there's no need to take precautionary action, especially if it comes at the cost of justice. Of course, that's an empirical question. So we can settle that by looking at the evidence. And that's what I do in the paper. And what I argue is that climate change threatens political catastrophe both at the global level in the long term and at the regional level in the short term. Now, I am sure that all of you are enlightened people, so I will not rehearse all of the basic and depressing facts about climate change. I will say a few quick things, though. First, the risk of globally, politically catastrophic climate change, I think, comes from 2 directions. One is just straightforward global warming, linear increases in temperature. The other is through severe climate events, what are often called tipping points, that are capable of abruptly altering weather patterns or ecosystems in devastating ways. Now, these two things are quite worrying, but global catastrophe is not likely to occur before the end of the century if it does occur. And if we take adequate action, hopefully it will not ever come to pass. But there is a real and legitimate risk of this right now. There was a Harvard study I read just earlier today that said if we continue with emitting at the same pace that we are right now, we have more than a 10% chance of warming beyond 6 degrees Celsius. Now, 6 degrees might not sound like a lot. The last time the world was 6 degrees warmer, palm trees were at the poles, alligators. 6 degrees, I think the way to think about that is like thinking about your own body temperature. I'm not super good at Celsius yet, but I think 36 is normal, right? But 42, you're dead. That's the same kind of principle here. Now, that, like I said, not likely to occur until the end of the century at the earliest. But with the climate change that we've already created, and that's going to continue arising in the coming years, many inevitably are going to experience some degree of political catastrophe in various regions in the world. This is already inevitable, already happening. Now, I think in the literature this is starting to change, but in general, up until very recently, economists, policymakers, and certainly political theorists paid this possibility far less attention. They don't talk about regional catastrophe as much. Maybe because the changes and events that would culminate in regional catastrophe are less sweeping, probably because they can also at least be partly remedied through international action. Probably also because they're more likely to occur first in the less wealthy parts of the world, parts of the world where not all the scholarships were used. Now, to understand how climate change risks regional political catastrophe, it's helpful to remember that whenever scientists speak about temperature increases, they're almost always referring to global averages. This can obscure the fact that even minor increases in average global temperature can mean huge increases for certain areas. For instance, the world has warmed about 1.2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial averages, but the Arctic has warmed about 4 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of variation. This suggests another point. There are localized tipping points. Increases of just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius can abruptly impact regional weather patterns, resulting in, for instance, protracted droughts. I didn't think about this until now, but we're in year 13 of septiembre here, right? That is caused because there's a serious amount of warm water right off the coast of New Zealand. And a lot of the rain that Chile receives comes from that area, but the warm water there prevents precipitation clouds from crossing the Pacific and getting to us. But this is happening all over the world. Right now, warming in the Pacific is also leading to considerably more frequent and severe cyclones in East Asia. Now, regional catastrophe does not necessarily entail political catastrophe, or regional climate change does not mean that it will be politically catastrophic. In order for regional climate change to become catastrophic, basically states or regions' anticipatory or response capabilities have to be overwhelmed, and international assistance has to be absent. Now, I think that suggests two areas on which we should focus precautionary action beyond just limiting emissions. We need to ensure that those states and regions that are going to be affected, that are going to be hit hardest by climate change, that they're ready for that, and that they have the resources necessary for responding. I think we also have to be prepared to offer assistance or compensation to help with the effects of unavoidable loss and damage that are going to occur that you can't prevent. Okay, so that's one objection. And basically, the point is, yes, climate change will be politically catastrophic. Second objection, this is a very happy talk. Sorry. Okay, second objection, and the last one I'm going to describe, is that subordinating fairness to efficacy in any context is a really big risk, given that it means giving states dangerous emergency powers, and that's going to open the door for authoritarian abrogations of rights, the diminution of democracy, other abuses. For that reason, maybe we should just reject this argument that we can set aside justice concerns for efficacy. Now, I think that's a really, really important objection, and I have a whole other chapter in my book that focuses just on that. But in the chapter that I'm presenting right now, I offer a little bit of an initial response that I can describe. I say, first of all, there's no reason to suspect that undertaking precautionary action against politically catastrophic climate change would require us to sacrifice any of the most intimate, important individual freedoms and rights, like freedoms of conscience or worship or the right to peacefully assemble. Moreover, if fulfilling our precautionary duties were in some way to affect individual rights, I argue that it must do so only to the extent necessary for alleviating or preventing catastrophe. There's a duty of accountability there, and I'll describe that in just a minute. Now, of course, any potential limitation of rights is still troubling, but it's important to recognize, I think, that should we have to sacrifice some amount of justice or some amount of rights, such limitations would not be a break from ordinary politics, inside or outside of emergencies. We do this all the time, actually. Now, consider the possibility of prohibiting climate disinformation. That's one thing that I argue for in this chapter, and especially the next one. I say it should be allowed to censor speech, disinformation. This is a great book that talks about just how devastating disinformation has been in the climate fight. The big gas companies, ExxonMobil and so on, they basically hired up all the tobacco industry lawyers and used exactly the same strategy to prevent public action, right? That's the whole point of this book. So I think we should be able to limit that kind of disinformation. Now, obviously, that would constitute censorship. So what I'm saying is we should have censorship, and that sounds bad. It certainly would be a limit on free expression, but freedom of expression has never been absolute. Even the most liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill make exceptions for harm-inducing speech. Even the most liberal states have laws and statutes against libel or hate speech or inciting public riots and violence and so on. So we limit speech all the time. Now, I say also in the paper, maybe we'll have to limit property rights in certain ways. Ugh, scary, right? I like my property. Look at all of it here. Now, here we might think about prohibiting fossil fuel producers from developing the already owned oil assets that they have. Probably some of you have heard of the keep it in the ground movement. That's the idea, right? Or maybe we will really restrict the scope and the duration of green technology patents so that that kind of technology spreads throughout the world. Just to be clear, what makes this so contentious? We can see how contentious this is because even during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was and still is a real debate about the status of the patents for the vaccines. The companies that made those vaccines didn't want to share it even with a global health emergency, right? So that's what I'm saying. Maybe we'll have to address these kind of issues. Now, scary, but again, not very different from ordinary practice, particularly during emergencies. It's often thought legitimate, for instance, to seize and redistribute the stocks of food suppliers during a famine, or to nationalize and repurpose factories during a war or a pandemic. Now, the same kind of argument holds with democracy. If we have to impose limits on democratic institutions and practices, that's scary. Now, I say in the paper, there's no plausible grounds for thinking that precaution would require any serious anti-democratic measures like suspending elections or disenfranchising people or autocratic dictatorship. I take that up in a lot greater detail in another chapter of the book again. I don't think there's any risk of that. But a commitment to precaution may lead us to consider implementing certain limits on what democratic decisions can authorize. But of course, we do that already with constitutions, right? Ordinary constitutional restrictions prevent democracies from doing certain things. For instance, we might stipulate that just as no democratic public or representative government can authorize the enslavement of some people for the benefit of others, neither can they enact policy that will credibly risk political catastrophe. To take another example here, we might also consider just prohibiting certain people from holding certain public offices. I'm thinking of people that have deep connections to the fossil fuel industry or have a history of open and public climate denialism. That sounds controversial, but again, fairly common practice in certain sense. In post-war Germany and Austria, former Nazi Party members were barred from holding public office. To this day, in Texas, which is not necessarily a beacon of justice, but still, convicted felons are prevented from holding public office, which is to say many states have similar kinds of rules in other situations. Now, these examples, I think, suggest another kind of response concerning public reason and the weight of moral duties. For those of you who have had the misfortune of having to read the political obligation literature, which is heavy and very technical, very rich, but very difficult, political obligation theorists commonly argue that duties only hold in a pro tanto sense, which means that our duties may justifiably be outweighed in certain pressing circumstances. But those same theorists carefully stipulate that although these kind of exigent circumstances might override duty, it never erases it. The famous example is I make a promise to Constanza to go to lunch, and as I'm on my way to lunch, I see a man having a heart attack. So I stop. And I do everything I can to help this man who's having a heart attack. Unfortunately, that means I missed my lunch. I'm sorry. What happens there is I had a duty to go to lunch. I made a promise, right, to go to lunch. That duty was outweighed by the necessity of helping this man who's having a heart attack. But it was outweighed, not erased. I still have to tell Constanza, I'm sorry about that I broke our promise. That's the point here. Now, for that reason, we need ex post facto explanations to adversely affected parties, and that suggests a requirement of accountability. Now, such a requirement would mean that an explanation is owed to those people, current generations, who are going to have to bear the heaviest burdens of preventing politically catastrophic climate change, assuming that the burdens that they're facing are in some way unfair. Now, there are explanations for that, as my chapter is meant to show. But in addition to those general explanations, we also have to have specific explanations for particular policies. Why were they necessary? And these should clearly specify who's responsible for acting, why, when, and how. Okay. I think if we take that duty seriously, the duty of accountability, we protect against ineffective, unnecessary, or inordinately burdensome policies. And again, I think that duty of accountability is easy to codify in the law. I was reading the proposal for the new constitution before the vote last Sunday, and one of the things that it said in the articles, between Articles 300 and 306, which were about the states of emergency, they said if there's a state of emergency declared, the executive has to give an explanation of what they're going to do and why they have to do it to the legislative that's essentially to say they have a duty of accountability. Okay, so I'm going to summarize very briefly everything that I've been saying. I think I'm still, yeah, okay. I've defined political catastrophe as a situation of extreme and enduring material scarcity in which the only way to meet my basic needs is by denying another person or other people the ability to do the same. I said that this way of thinking about catastrophe is directly related to John Rawls's objective circumstances of justice. In other words, political catastrophe is a situation in which we lack the material basis necessary for sustaining or realizing justice. I said that under such conditions, fair social cooperation and political stability are in jeopardy. That situation is very grave. For that reason, I also argue that when faced with political catastrophe, agents are justified in prioritizing precautionary efficacy over ordinary moral constraints like distributed fairness. Crucially, though, this is not for reasons external to justice, but for the sake of justice itself. My essential claim here is that whenever the material conditions that make justice possible are themselves credibly imperiled, specific applications or instances of justice can and must become secondary to precautionary efficacy. This argument, finally, is relevant to the problem of climate change, which now already threatens political catastrophe at the regional level and will soon do the same at the global level if we fail to act. Yeah. Now, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. So thank you, especially for suffering my English again. I'm very happy to take questions in Spanish and respond in that way. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Voy en español.
Sí,
And you can answer in English or Spanish.
Gracias.
Me parece que la definición, si puedes volver una diapositiva atrás con la definición de catástrofe política, recién la acabo de conocer, me lleva, estoy como yéndome, o esto es muy estricto, muy restrictivo, por lo tanto tremendamente difícil, lo que hace que la relevancia de todos los siguientes sea menor, o es algo tremendamente común. No logro encontrar cosas al medio. La razón es la siguiente. Para un economista, en una decisión estática, comerme la manzana yo o la persona que tengo al frente sería un estado de political catastrophe. También es posible que tú también lo planteaste como un juego de suma cero. Sin embargo, es súper extensa la literatura de teoría de juegos respecto de cómo, cuando existen juegos de suma cero, existen infinitas posibilidades de cooperación. Mencionaste al inicio la idea de cooperación y la dificultad, pero después no seguiste por ese lado. Pero básicamente, si partimos desde el conocido Fourth Theorem o el teorema de la factibilidad de Friedman, plantea: si una cooperación me da al menos el mejor escenario, estoy dispuesto a cooperar. Por lo tanto, existen infinitas formas de articular juegos de suma cero para lograr equilibrios de mayor bienestar. Y en ese sentido, me quedo de nuevo con esta pregunta, ¿no es cierto? O es muy común, precisamente por la competencia, o es altamente difícil que efectivamente no exista la posibilidad de encontrar otra solución que denegarla completamente a la otra persona, la capacidad de satisfacer su necesidad, precisamente porque existen todas estas infinitas alternativas de resolver una asignación de recursos sin intervención del Estado, sin acuerdo político. A este punto tal vez indicar que soy economista. Entonces, quisiera si me pudieras elaborar algo más sobre el concepto de catástrofe política, cómo darme ejemplos, cómo lo ves. Gracias.
Ya, muchas gracias por eso. Y perdón, ¿suma cero?
Zero sum.
Zero sum. Ah, ya, por supuesto. Ok, muchas gracias por esa pregunta y voy a intentar de responder en español, pero mi español bien feo y si hay dudas sobre lo que estoy diciendo, no duden en preguntarme. Ok, voy a decir en primer lugar, qué buena pregunta, difícil. Now, en el libro, hay dos cosas que quiero decir y después voy a dar par de ejemplos. Importante reconocer que estoy hablando sobre necesidades básicas y en el libro explico que eso refiere a alimentación básica, agua, etc. También en el libro hablo sobre esas situaciones de catástrofe en términos escalares. Una escala, no categórica, no como tenemos catástrofe política, no. Hay un rango de condiciones de scarcity, moderate scarcity, escasez moderada. Y hay diferentes posiciones fuera de eso. De hecho, esa idea yo creo que es importante, porque también no es súper bien especificada en la literatura. Ross, como dije, adaptó esta posición de Hume. Y Hume habla sobre, tiene ejemplos de una persona después de un shipwreck, y no hay comida, no hay agua en esa situación. Hume dice que no hay realmente consideraciones de justicia. Now, esa idea parece bien categórica. Yo creo que eso es un error. Y tengo otro paper, otro artículo en una revista, se llama Philosophical Studies, que intenta resolver exactamente este problema en la literatura. Explica cómo los contenidos de justicia pueden cambiar en relaciones a diferentes grados de escasez. Entonces, hay una escala. Now, situaciones o ejemplos. En el libro, especialmente en el primer capítulo, hablo de verdes. Y uso varios artículos diarios. Por ejemplo, después de Hurricane Irene, 2014, había un artículo en New York Times sobre la situación. Dijo, hay una escasez fuerte de comida, acceso a agua limpia, y por eso hay mucho más conflicto social, peleas o problemas. Y dice, las instituciones están como en decadencia, breaking down. Eso a mí voy a decir exactamente entendible, porque eso es exactamente la idea de catástrofe política. Sin suficientes recursos materiales, vamos a entrar en una situación de colapso. Colapso. Hay otra situación en Haití en 2008. Después de, y siempre tiene problemas, pero después de un hurricane ese año también había hambre fuerte. Y de nuevo New York Times dice, las personas están comiendo tierra. Una semana después de ese artículo, el gobierno cayó. 2008, en México, tortilla riots. Debido a problemas en agricultura, debido a demanda de biofuels, el precio de maíz subió bastante. De repente, harto hambre. De repente, conflicto social. Y el presidente de México en ese momento dijo, si no ponemos atención a temas de agricultura, de escasez, vamos a ver más y más esta situación. También en Siria, justo antes del inicio de la guerra civil, había un colapso de agricultura que siguió después de su sequía más fuerte en the records. Yo creo que hay conexiones acá, es decir, cuando tenemos escasez de alimentación, de agua, eso va a aumentar el conflicto social, eso va a desafiar instituciones políticas y con suficientemente tiempo colapsa. O colapsa. Gracias. Colapsa, yeah, eso. Ojalá eso.
Lo que veo es, hay una relación tal vez interesante de explicitar que tiene que ver con instituciones democráticas. Porque instituciones no democráticas, instituciones tal vez no reguladas como el mercado, no están asociadas al... Estoy tratando como de encontrar el espacio donde cae esa definición en mi concepto de instituciones.
Yeah, la idea acá con catástrofes políticas, y eso es el foco de otro capítulo, por eso no hablo mucho sobre eso. Este capítulo está dedicado a la idea de que podemos priorizar otras consideraciones de eficacia sobre consideraciones de justicia en ciertas condiciones de escasez extrema. Otro capítulo, que también era un artículo, habla mucho más sobre ese impacto sobre respuestas de gobierno que necesitamos hacer en ese respecto.
Thank you. My question is mainly just to clarify certain things. So if you can go back a little bit and go into the one that you talk about harm. You talk about harm and define it minorities and that. If you remember.
I think it was here, but I don't think I have it there. But I have the definition here.
Yeah.
Wait, actually, it might be on.
Sorry.
No, it's right here. Right here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So what I'm thinking about is that I'm wondering if you have any account or anything specific about the domain of harm or the type of harm. It seems to me that later on you talk about basic needs as the ones that are dominating the definition for a catastrophe. And I'm just wondering if when you're talking about harm, are you referring to minorities that suffer that particular type of harm, or could it be relations or other types of harm that derive from those? What do you have in mind to situate that context?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So in the paper, I didn't include this in the talk because it's fairly technical, and just a little, maybe I thought maybe a little boring, but maybe not. But thank you for that question. And sorry, I didn't catch the.
Gabriela.
Gabriela, okay, thank you for that. Now, in the paper, I basically just borrow conception of harm from the intergenerational justice literature. There's a good book by these two guys, Dominic Roser and Lucas Meyer, called Intergenerational Justice. In that book, they present a notion of intergenerational harm. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do for various reasons. There's something called the non-identity problem. I've heard of with RFID, which makes it really hard to say that you harm two people. And so what Roser and Meyer try to do is basically define harm in relation to a threshold. So we harm people when we create situations that are going to have to put people below a certain threshold. Now for me, I just basically the innovation is just to define the threshold in relation to political catastrophe. So we harm people in the sense that I'm using here. Of course, we can harm them in other ways, but the operant sense from my argument is that we harm them when we put them in conditions in which the only way of satisfying their basic needs is by denying other people the ability to do the same. Which is to say, when we put them in conditions of extreme material scarcity. Now, that kind of harm, I think, needs something like that to justify relaxing justice constraints. Now, of course, there are other kinds of harm. We could say, we take a more ambitious notion of harm. We could say something like, if we harm people, if we create conditions in which they're not able to have shelter, basic education, access to healthcare, and so on, the kind of suite of basic goods. And that's what Myra and Rose are doing. But I need a much more minimal conception of harm because I'm looking for extreme cases. And I'm looking at those extreme cases because I think only in extreme cases can we really justify relaxing fairness constraints, relaxing justice constraints. We can't normally, I don't think it's like a normal thing to say that we'll leave fairness on the side. We can only really do that in truly exceptional cases. So that's why I have a kind of more extreme notion of harm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Russ. Such an interesting talk. I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to limit myself to two, and then maybe later over a coffee we can keep going. So, as a first question and concern, I would just love to hear you talk about what you would do with sort of a classic sort of demandingness objection to your whole theory of precautionary duty. The basic worry being that what would be involved in fulfilling the various duties that fall under this heading of precautionary duty would be so extensive and so demanding that it can't really be the case that we in fact have these duties, because it would make it that essentially it's so demanding that no matter what we would be doing, we would still be failing to fulfill these duties.
Right.
So a basic kind of a demandingness style objection, what are you going to say, something like that? And then within this, the package of duties that you've presented, it strikes me that the duty to protect is probably the most demanding.
No, for sure.
Yeah. And so then I saw you making two moves that I thought were perhaps designed to deal with the kind of demanding objection, especially to the duty to protect. And that was to say, well, look, realizing that duty is unlikely to infringe basic liberty rights. I think you said something along those lines. I'm not sure if it was just like unlikely to or could not in principle. So that was a question mark I had. That was why it kind of took it for me. And then you also pointed out that these are merely pro tanto duties, and they could be overridden in certain.
These are not, but the point I made with the pro tanto duties was, but I'll
okay, so that wasn't part of it. But anyway, so I saw you making moves that I thought were perhaps designed to cope with demanding this objection, especially to the duty to protect. Just would love to hear you say more about that. And then as a second question, this is just to take several steps back. Do you argue in the book or elsewhere that we in fact have a precautionary duty, or have you not made that argument yet? If you have made that argument, I would love to hear it.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you very much for those. Okay, so yes, I do. I mean, this whole chapter is basically devoted to defending this, that we have these duties. This is, for me, the shape of our precautionary duties.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I call it the integrationist approach is because I think it has a kind of realist edge on saying that we have to prioritize efficacy over justice. You can imagine the kind of like Gauss or Bernard Williams kind of saying, yeah, obviously. But I'm not doing that because it's only power that matters or something like that. I'm kind of motivating that from a concern for justice itself. So the reason we can relax justice constraints is because we care about justice. We want to preserve the conditions in which it's possible. So this is my precautionary theory, I guess. Now, with the demandingness objection, you were 100% right about that. I spent time in the paper talking about that. I didn't really mention it so much here, but there are two main ways that I've tried to hedge against that. The first one is this, the reasonableness proviso, which is to put an upper limit on precautionary duty. So you're totally right. The duty to protect, that can be a bottomless pit. There's a lot of talk about this in the economics literature, for instance, when you're talking about discount rates. And if we want to benefit in the future, all of a sudden we should sacrifice all consumption right now for the benefit of the future because it'll grow. There's a guy Koopmans or something like that. Anyway, so this is a real problem with any duty to protect. It can be overly demanding. An upper limit of that is provided by the reasonableness proviso. There can be no duties that are so extreme that you yourself face political protection. So if I say, look, current generations, we have to sacrifice for the sake of future generations. But we shouldn't sacrifice so much that we are now ourselves facing political catastrophe. That's an upper limit. Now, another way that I limit it is by limiting the kinds of threats that we're responding to. So, I could say there is a chance tomorrow that Cthulhu will rise to the ocean and destroy all the world. And we must take precautionary action against Cthulhu. And how are we going to respond to that? Well, Ross, I don't think Cthulhu is going to happen. Yes, Cthulhu is going to happen. So how do we respond with something like that? Well, I just basically steal from Henry Shue. I cite him obviously, but his theory of precaution identifies what he calls the anti-paranoia requirement. The anti-paranoia requirement says that we have to have a sense of what mechanisms would have to be in play for this threat to arise. I could not tell you how Cthulhu would come out of the ocean. Okay. He also says that we have to see those mechanisms at work. And so with this, I use the language of scientifically plausible. That's the anti-paranoia requirement. Reasonably likely. It's reasonably likely when we see the conditions for the catastrophe starting to form. So now we have a pretty restricted range of potential issues, and we have an upper limit. And that's the two ways that I get around the bottomless.
I guess I would say that the upper limit seems very, very hard to do.
Definitely.
Yeah. So it stops looking like a limit really, because it feels like, oh, that would, you can imagine. Well, yeah, and the other thing I would just very quickly, so I'm going to come back. Do you accept an ought implies can type of principle in general with respect to duty?
Am I Kantian? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I need to think about that one more. Sometimes I'm actually, it's kind of, I shouldn't even say this. I have an idea about this, but no, I don't know. But I would say this. You're right. It does seem like an extreme limit. It seems like an extreme upper limit. But one way that I would try to sell this to you is just like the kind of Rawlsian original position. I could say, imagine that you're in an original position. You don't know what generation you belong to. You don't know anything about yourself. You don't even know what generation. You also know that political catastrophe can happen. Are you going to accept any measure below that upper limit if you know that there's a scientifically plausible, reasonably likely threat of catastrophe? I think not. I think it would be really hard to tell future generations, like, we wanted to protect you, but
Not that.
yeah, exactly, not that much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that.
No, great, thank you very much.
Yo tengo tres preguntas también, que son un poco específicas, pero bueno, una es, ¿por qué hablo de deberes? Porque me da la sensación de que la mayoría de los casos son responsabilidades políticas, que requieren corrección más que un deber similar al deber de decirme a mí, disculpa, no puedo. Entonces, esa distinción entre deber y responsabilidad. Después, sí, haciendo un poco de analogía con la literatura de explotación, también se han, en esos casos, de mercados en general, también se han criticado muchos autores de dar argumentos de eficacia. La respuesta de estos autores, que creo que también se aplica en este contexto, es que dicen, bueno, sí, porque es eficacia, pero no es solamente eficacia. También hay un deber de justicia de prioridad, de tercer prioridad. Entonces, me parece que en el caso, cuando tuve, en el caso de la salud que tuviste, claro, viste el caso médico, de los recursos médicos, viste el caso de las vacunas, uno podría decir, claro, no se está respetando por edad, género, qué sé yo, pero sí hay otro criterio de justicia, un principio de justicia prioritario, y claro, y tenemos dos criterios de justicia que están en tensión, es decir, no es que sea por un lado justicia y por otro lado eficacia, sino que tenemos dos principios de justicia que están en contradicción y están en tensión entre ellos. Hay un paper de David Miller que también explica cómo en el caso de fair trade distintos principios de justicia pueden llevar como a contradicciones y a problemas, y creo que eso podría aplicar acá.
Tiene que...
Sí. Y la tercera pregunta tiene que ver con el tema de ex post. Entonces, claro, en el ejemplo que tú dabas claro, tenemos una situación de urgencia, pero después ex post tenemos un deber de
por ejemplo, pedirme a mí disculpas en el caso de Constanza,
Sí.
que tú... pero me parece que pasa algo similar en este caso, claro, pero hay la pregunta que, claro, hacemos, por ejemplo, dando estos ejemplos iniciales que tú tenías en el caso de Chile y de India, en el que los países más pobres tendrían que, en el fondo, asumir estos costos. Uno podría decir, claro, incluso en estos países que, entre comillas, pobres, asuman los costos, pero uno podría decir, claro, ex post podría haber alguna suerte de redistribución. En el fondo, en el momento hicimos lo que había que hacer, pero después, una vez que salvamos la situación, podría haber una redistribución ex post. Entonces, esas serían como mis tres preguntas.
Ya. Excelente pregunta, muchas gracias por eso. Especialmente la segunda, yo creo que nunca he oído eso y fuerte. Ok, now, la primera pregunta, ¿por qué estoy hablando de deberes y no responsabilidades? Porque no soy muy buen filósofo y no soy súper especificado en el tema. La diferencia entre deberes, obligaciones y responsabilidades. Pero la idea para mí es que tenemos un deber fundamental, que es responder a amenazas de catástrofe. Eso tiene que ver con otro concepto, en otro lugar en el libro, yo sé que es un poco fome, digo cada 2 minutos, otro lugar en el libro, pero en otro lugar en el libro hablo sobre una idea de legitimidad fundamental, y legitimidad fundamental para mí es como la legitimidad que sigue cuando un Estado tiene la capacidad de proteger seguridad básica. Nuestro deber de precaución es muy relacionado. No podemos tener legitimidad fundamental sin satisfacer este deber. Entonces, sí es un deber público, pero es un deber. Yo creo que no hay nada en mi mente al menos que distingue eso de una responsabilidad. Quizás no es estrictamente moral, quizás más existencial, en cierto sentido, pero tiene un valor. Porque si no podemos mantener seguridad básica, si no podemos mantener una situación de escasez moderada, es decir, no extrema, tenemos problemas morales. Okay. Now, la segunda pregunta, más o menos, sí entiendo correctamente, es gracioso porque como, mira, hay ciertos argumentos free market que dicen también necesitamos decir, fairness al lado, eficacia más importante o eficiencia más importante, al menos. Y no quiero ser parte de ese grupo. Yo creo que una diferencia importante entre mi argumento y un argumento así, no estoy diciendo que eficacia es siempre el valor más importante. Yo creo que en la gran mayoría de situaciones, el segundo más importante, pero eficacia tiene una relevancia suprema en situaciones de catástrofe. Porque en esa situación, las condiciones necesarias para justicia son en sí mismos amenazadas. Entonces, nos importa eficacia solamente porque nos importa justicia. Y no es el caso, yo creo, para los free market types. Pero absolutamente quiero leer ese paper de David Miller, por favor. Now, ex post facto explanation. Quizás también necesitamos hablar sobre ex post facto redistribuciones. Sí, absolutamente. Y no hay nada en mi argumento que está opuesto a eso. De hecho, ese punto acá, de fairness principle secundario, es decir, deberíamos intentar hacer la cosa de manera más justa posible. Mi punto es solamente que no deberíamos decir que una consideración de justicia limitada particular puede ser como una condición de tomar acción. Pero frecuentemente la literatura es muy así. Frecuentemente va a leer cosas como, la única manera es lo que podríamos justificar poner deberes de precaución en generaciones contemporáneas porque van a ser más pobres. Si podemos, no sé, dejar los casos al futuro, quizás con deuda o algo así. Yo creo que eso es un error en razonamiento, porque como necesitamos actuar para preservar las condiciones en lo que justicia tiene sentido. No debería ser una como falsificación o algo así. También hay argumentos contra poner límites de desarrollo en India o China, donde hay más emisiones que cualquier otra parte del mundo, ¿verdad? Demasiado. Y dicen frecuentemente, no podemos poner límites en ellos porque eso no es justo. Pero para mí, la idea es que si nos importa justicia, necesitamos ese límite. Absolutamente, después podemos tener estas conversaciones sobre justicia. Y hay demandas legítimas para corrección. Pero eso no podría ser un límite en acción, la implementación de acciones, medidas de protección.
Estamos un poquito pasados del tiempo que serían más preguntas, pero respondemos en parte.
¿Sí? Ok. Muchas gracias por su atención.